Hello.
Hi again. When I was a Jehovah's Witness in the 1970s, I worked part-time supporting my pioneer work in Toronto, and one of my favorite passages was Acts 17, verses 22 to 31. Paul's great speech in the Areopagus, that is Mars Hill, in Athens. What I didn't know at the time, although I memorized the speech, one of the mental diversions of the time to give myself something to do while I was working secular occupations, memorizing while I was working manually. This speech, I didn't notice that it was the only specimen of Paul's preaching to a sophisticated pagan audience. Somehow I intuited that. That's why I wanted to memorize the speech, but I hadn't done an exhaustive search of the book of Acts to realize, when you do that this is the only specimen we have of Paul speaking to an educated pagan audience. Luke's pattern in the book of Acts is to select one specimen of each type of presentation. So, for instance, we have one speech of Paul to a Jewish audience in a synagogue, Acts 13. We have another specimen of Paul speaking to pagans unsophisticated in Acts 14. And then we have a specimen of Paul preaching, that is, delivering a message to leaders of a church in Acts 20, Ephesus. Then we have this one specimen, 10 verses long, of Paul preaching to educated Athenians, or the highest educated pagans. How does he do it? So I wanted to learn it as a Jehovah's Witness to see how I might better improve my preaching. What I didn't notice was some of the things that were absent. We'll get to that in the next segment perhaps. But let's read the speech just to, if you can probably listen to it again, because I don't doubt most of you will be familiar with the words and will have read it with pleasure before, but maybe listen this time for what is there and what is not there when Paul preaches to an educated audience in Athens.
Acts 17, I'm starting at verse 22.
In the New World Translation.
Yes. Paul now stood in the midst of the Areopagus and said, "Men of Athens, I behold that in all things you seem to be more given to the fear of the deities than others are. For instance, while passing along and carefully observing your objects of veneration, I also found an altar on which had been inscribed, 'To an unknown God.' Therefore, what you are unknowingly giving godly devotion to, this I am publishing to you. The God that made the world and all the things in it, being as this one is, Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in handmade temples. Neither is he attended to by human hands as if he needed anything, because he himself gives to all persons life and breath and all things. And he made out of one man every nation of men, to dwell upon the entire surface of the earth. And he decreed the appointed times and the set limits of the dwelling of men, for them to seek God, if they might grope for him and really find him, although in fact he is not far off from each one of us. For by him we have life and move and exist, even as certain ones of the poets among you have said, for we are also his progeny. Seeing therefore that we are the progeny of God, we ought not to imagine that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, like something sculptured by the art and contrivance of man. True, God has overlooked the times of such ignorance, yet now he is telling mankind that they should all everywhere repent, because he has set a day in which he purposes to judge the inhabited earth in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed, and he has furnished a guarantee to all men that he has resurrected him from the dead. Well, when they heard of a resurrection of the dead, some began to mock, while others said, We will hear you about this even another time. Thus Paul went out from their midst. But some men joined themselves to him and became believers, among whom also were Dionysius, a judge of the court of the Areopagus, and a woman named Damaris, and others besides them. I'm not always good on the names.
We don't have a record here that Paul was particularly successful in Athens. He now moves on to Corinth in the next chapter, but he does make some impact, as you can see from this. I think the first thing you want to mention is that if you have the silver sword, there are quite a few changes. Nothing greatly significant. We could mention a few of them in the next video or two when we get into the text more closely. I guess the one I want to mention now, though, is the reference in verse 29 where you have progeny of God.
Right.
A word not much used nowadays. They've now changed that one to children of God. Other stuff we'll get to in detail. I think the thing you want to notice right away, though, is in 10 verses, what is the main subject of the whole sermon? God.
Yeah.
He uses the connection with the altar that they've set up just in case they've missed one God in their multiple attempts to cover all the bases and get all the gods on side. He points out in verse 16 that Paul, when he got to Athens, maybe for the first time he'd ever visited it, was extremely irritated at what he found. The pagan altars and temples and statues everywhere.
Yeah.
Just what a Pharisee never wants to see.
But when you read his sermon to them, none of that irritation seems to come out in the words he uses.
No.
So I think that is a very good teaching point, if you like, for us. Because ex-witnesses, oftentimes, because we're angry with what happened to us and wasted time or whatever, false doctrines or wrong teachings, losing your family, that can cause you to have a lot of pain and irritation and anger even. But when you're talking to witnesses, you have to remember you were once a witness. So you would want someone to reveal these things to you. But you have to do it in kindness, or else you shut their ears and you miss an opportunity to reach them.
Similarly, Paul has to suppress his Pharisaic Jewish tendencies as a loyal Jew. He has to suppress his instinct probably to smash everything he sees.
Yeah, because it's offensive to God.
And find a common ground. And he finds the common ground with this statue. Just in case we've missed a God, let's call this one to an unknown God. And he uses that as the building block. And then if you follow through the next 9 verses after the first verse here, 22, it's all about God from beginning to end, and expanding the Gentile notion of what God seems to be his goal here, to give them a bigger God, as he calls him at one point, Lord of heaven and earth. Well, if this God is Lord of heaven and earth, certain things follow from that, which we'll get to later. And where he goes with this doctrine of God is by verse 31, the last verse, where before he's cut off by his audience after he mentions resurrection. The last thing he wants to get to with them, the bottom line of this sermon therefore, is there's a day of judgment coming. He says God has furnished a guarantee to all men that they will be there on this day of judgment, and that he's raised a man who will be the judge that day from the dead. So he gets to the resurrection, even though he's not mentioning a lot of things he would mention to a Jewish audience. The bottom line, though, is the judgment day. He says all of us will have to account to that God, the Lord of heaven and earth, for our deeds. And I would have to say that this was missing from our message as Jehovah's Witnesses. What we worried about was not standing before God on Judgment Day, but, well, Armageddon. Great Tribulation, Armageddon, would we be faithful?
Right.
And of course the carrot was paradise earth. So that brings us to what's not in the in this sermon, which we'll get to in the next segment.